Hello everyone, FPL Raptor here and welcome back to another video on my YouTube channel. In today's video we have my Game Week 7 deadline decisions. This is a weekly series where I round up the latest press conference updates and also answer your final questions and dilemmas ahead of the upcoming deadline. If you do enjoy today's video, please do smash that like button, and if you're new around here, make sure to subscribe as well. But without further ado, let's jump into it. So as always, let's start with the press conference updates. And if you do enjoy these videos every Friday, please do smash that like button. If you are new around here, please do consider subscribing. It massively supports me, and there is tons of content every single week to hopefully help guide you through the FPL season. And as of Friday, unfortunately, and I say unfortunately, it's probably a good thing, there weren't many major updates because there weren't really many notable players that are injured or that we were waiting on news from. So I'll try and fly through it a little bit quicker today because, yeah, largely nothing massive really came from the press conferences. So as of Friday afternoon at 3 p.m, and again, we might get news throughout the day and going into Saturday, on Arsenal, late decisions are to be made on White, Timber and Tomiyasu. Timber has not been called up for international duty over the international break, so my guess is probably that we might see none of these feature, maybe one of them. It's very difficult to tell with Arteta, but I have seen some people looking at maybe bringing in Timber this week. Unless Arteta's completely lying or unless he makes a very quick recovery, it's probably not the week to go and target Timber. And then after, from next week and beyond, the fixtures aren't really there, so you might have slightly missed the boat, I suppose, with Timber, although the Arsenal defence are so fantastic that I guess you can bring them in whenever you want. Zinchenko is expected to also return after the break. In all honesty, Raya, Gabriel, Saliba, or probably look elsewhere with your transfers. Even someone like a Pedro Porro is probably a better transfer in than someone like a Timber at the moment. Speaking of Spurs, Son is unlikely to be available for Game Week 7, was the wording from Postecoglou, but he is pushing hard. And did continue to say that it doesn't seem like he is close. He basically said that Son's very unlikely himself to go away on international duty simply because if he's not available for Spurs, which looks likely to be the case, then why would they send him on international duty? I think that Son will be available from Game Week 8 and beyond after the international break, and as a result, I do think he'll start to come into our thinking a little bit more. But as of Game Week 7, it looks very unlikely. And also said that he thinks that Udogie will be okay. So, largely positive updates on Spurs, but it probably looks like Timo Werner will be starting in the absence of Son once again. On Man City, De Bruyne has been ruled out for Game Week 7 along with Ake. Other than that, there are no major issues that were raised with Man City and by Pep, apart from obviously Rodri and Bob being out long term. This obviously means that Foden starting, which looked like it could be a good possibility anyway, looks even more likely now if De Bruyne is out because Foden is playing in that central role this season. So I think there is a very good chance for a Foden start. And I am very, very tempted on my wildcard. He's not in my current draft, but I think what I'll do tonight is if we get a rumour that Foden starts tomorrow in the deadline stream, I might just make a little Foden draft just in case I get the desire and urge to go for him. But sadly, it would be dropping one of Palmer or Saka, which at the moment just doesn't feel right. But I do want to get on Foden, preferably ahead of the curve before he starts scoring those points. On Newcastle, Isak and Wilson are both confirmed out until at least Game Week 8, so no Isak once again, which of course means that Gordon will probably be starting as the number 9, and again will be on penalties himself. By the way, because Gordon wasn't on the pitch midweek, and also Isak and Wilson weren't, Fabian Schär took a penalty. So we now know that Fabian Schär is 4th in line. So if Gordon isn't on the pitch at any point, and Fabian Schär is, we could have a penalty-taking defender, which is absolutely crazy to say, but yeah, Gordon looks like a really good option at the moment, playing as the 9 on pens. Speaking of Fabian Schär, him and Pope, who were slight doubts, and I think they're both flagged on the site, they should be okay, according to Eddie Howe. Whether or not you want to trust that or not, it's up to you. And Howe also hopes that Trippier will be fit too. So if you were a little bit concerned about the Newcastle defence, or maybe you were really looking at starting McNeil or Calvert-Lewin because you thought the Newcastle defence would be weaker, they don't look as weak as maybe we first thought. On Brighton, Van Hecke is expected to be out for around 4 to 6 weeks. The original prognosis was 6 weeks, but it looks like it might be a little bit quicker than that. And João Pedro is expected to be out for slightly longer as well. Why this is important, especially Van Hecke, is obviously Spurs play Brighton this week. I think that this could be another bloodbath unless they somehow start to change their tactics and Hertzler isn't completely stubborn. But if it is, once again, Webster and Dunk, I've seen a few people suggest it could be Igor and Dunk. Regardless, I think Van Hecke's such a massive miss that this is really good news if you own Spurs assets. I think they could get a few goals here. I don't even mind a very rogue captaincy punt on Solanke, and we'll discuss captaincy at the end of the video. There are also unconfirmed reports, and these are unconfirmed. Deitch did not mention these in the presser, but there are unconfirmed reports that both Branthwaite, and that is a spelling mistake by the way, Branthwaite and Mikalenko have picked up minor injuries. But again, neither of those were spoken about by Deitch. So I'm not telling you that those are definitely the case, but we are seeing rumours circulating that Branthwaite picked up a thigh injury in training and that Mikalenko could be out for 2 to 3 weeks with a minor injury. If we get these confirmed as of tomorrow, I will discuss that, of course, in the deadline stream, so make sure to tune into that. But as of right now, these are unconfirmed. This will, of course, make the Everton defence much weaker, and if you are on a wild card, and maybe you're looking at something like a Mikalenko or a Pickford, this probably puts you off doing so for now. And it might even make the likes of Dwight McNeil and Calvert-Lewin slightly weaker. If they're weaker at the back, maybe that'll invite more pressure on. Maybe these are just hypotheses, but regardless, that's something to keep an eye on. And it's the last thing that Everton need at the moment. And if you've got Anthony Gordon, this could be potentially very good news. Finally, on Wolves and then Villa. So on Wolves, Bueno is okay, and Dawson has returned to partial training this week, which means that the Wolves defence is starting to get a little bit stronger. And by the way, Wolves are actually 13th for XGC this season, and they've had the most terrible opening fixtures. I don't think this Wolves defence is as bad as some people are suggesting. They're kind of middling for defensive data, despite having much more difficult fixtures than a lot of teams. So I don't mind the idea, and you'll see in my wildcard at the end, I'll give you my updated wildcard draft. I don't mind the idea of one Wolves defender if they can rotate in and you don't have to start them every week. And then finally, Aston Villa obviously picked up a few injuries midweek. Ramsey and Bailey are both apparently doubts. Onana is also a doubt, but he is expected to be available. So of the three, Onana looks more likely. If Ramsey and Bailey don't play, and of course John McGinn has been ruled out as well, Duran could be getting his first start of the season. So if you brought Duran in a few weeks ago and he's not been starting and you're thinking about selling, I'd be tempted to start Duran this week because we know how good he is off the bench regardless, but it could be finally that we see a starting lineup with Rodgers, Duran and Watkins, which could be very exciting. And we know how bad Manchester United have been defensively recently. So those was it. That was the major updates from the press conference. Now let's get on to answering your key questions ahead of Game Week 7. So probably the major question that you guys had for me ahead of this video was around Luis Diaz. And if we do get a leak that Luis Diaz isn't starting, who is the best person to replace him with? So just to cover the reasoning for this, obviously if you've never tuned into one of my deadline streams or a deadline stream in general, we do often get team leaks or early team news around the teams that play earliest in the week. So on Saturday at 12:30, Liverpool will be playing Palace. Because the deadline is at 11, there is a chance that we get some early team leaks around players that will be starting or not. And because Luis Diaz played significant minutes midweek, he played 72 minutes and Gakpo was on the bench, lots of people are, again, hypothesizing that Luis Diaz will be on the bench for Game Week 7 and that Gakpo might get a start in the Premier League. I do think there is a reasonable chance of that happening, but I would also say all we've seen is that Luis Diaz is clearly very important to that Liverpool team. He started every Premier League game, he's then played 70 minutes midweek, and he's looked very good once again. I also didn't think it's out of the question that Luis Diaz starts. So if you are asking me right now, do I think Luis Diaz starts? I would sound like 55% no, 45% yes. So I would probably just about lean no. I think Gakpo might finally get a start on the left. But unless you are available closer to the deadline, unless you can wait around to see if we get a team league, I don't know that I would be fully comfortable selling Luis Diaz because what has changed? He's still a brilliant asset. He's still the same player that got 51 points in the opening 5 weeks. I know he blanked last week, but nothing has really changed other than there are now slight doubts around whether he starts. But you surely knew that would be the case when you brought him in, especially if you only wildcarded last week. So preferably, what you would do is tune into the deadline stream tomorrow, my deadline stream, and I will go through any updated news we get, and hopefully we'll find out if he starts or not. And if he doesn't, I'm not sure I would feel massively confident taking him out, because if he does play and he does start, Crystal Palace isn't a bad fixture at the moment. But let's say that you either just want to make the move, you don't want Luis Diaz any longer, or you do wait around for the deadline stream, and we do find out indeed that Luis Diaz doesn't start. Here are my top replacements in each position, based on who I would be looking to bring in for Luis Diaz. Now, the key thing and the obvious thing, unless you are playing your wildcard very, very soon, assuming you've already played it or you're saving it a bit longer, you need to also think about your future moves. So it's very easy for me to sit here and say, I would just do Luis Diaz to Mbermo. But if you know that next week you want to make a move to upgrade Chris Wood to Solanke, well, then you know yourself that you need to free up the funds to do that. So what I would do, as well as looking at who are your favourite replacements for Diaz, look at what are the future moves that you might want to make. Do you want to bring in Phil Foden in Game Week 9? If so, you probably want to have a price point available in that midfield that you can make the move for. Do you maybe want to downgrade Trent in future weeks to free up some funds? And as a result, it doesn't really matter. Are you looking to own this player for 5 weeks, 10 weeks, or only 2 weeks? So these are the things you need to go through for your own team. But at each price point, here are my favourite options. So between 4.6 and 5.5, let's say you're making a move because you want to try and bring in a Haaland or a Watkins, or you're freeing up funds to bring in a Palmer in another midfield slot. Let's say you need to really free up funds. For me, Rodgers still is the standout option at that cheap price. The fixtures coming up of Man United, Fulham and Bournemouth, they're really not terrible. And Man United this week looks like a brilliant matchup for Rodgers. Manchester United concede most of their chances through the centre, which is probably where Rodgers will be operating. That being said, the other place that we concede a lot of chances from is on the right-hand flank, or Villa's left, which is where Rodgers could be operating if Villa opt for a 4-4-2 with Watkins and Duran up front. I guess what I'm saying is it doesn't really matter where Rodgers operates in this game. It's a great fixture for him. But if you don't want to go for Rodgers, Mavididi would probably be my second favourite option between 4.6 and 5.5. Obviously, he's towards the upper end of that and you might not be able to afford him. But the fixtures coming up, Southampton and Ipswich in the next 4, it's a really nice run of fixtures. And Leicester, if they're going to pick up points, these are the 4 sort of spell of games that they need to pick up points in. So I would fancy Mavididi to do well. I know he didn't start at the beginning of the season, but he's put in some really good performances recently. I think his minutes are relatively secure now. And when Vardy's not on the pitch, and by the way, Vardy doesn't play 90 minutes every week now. When Vardy's not on the pitch, Mavididi should be on penalties as well. So I really like him as an option. Not a terrible fixture this week, and then going into Southampton next week. He's probably my second favourite option after Rodgers. And then I think my third favourite option probably is Carvalho. I do prefer Carvalho to Adama. I prefer Carvalho to Dibbling as well. If I had the funds on my wildcard draft, I'd probably have Carvalho in there. I just don't quite have enough for him. Do I think Carvalho starts every game? No. I think there will be the odd game he's benched, but I still do think he's first choice. And obviously the absence of Wissa just opens up an extra spot in the starting 11. They've paid a significant amount of money for him, and he's been pretty good for them. I don't think he's a brilliant FPL option. His XGI so far this season per 90 is only 0.2. So for me, Rodgers and Mavididi are both much better options than Carvalho. But obviously, if you can't squeeze up to them, then he is fine. And to be honest, Dibbling is a fine option as well. If you've only got a very limited amount of funds, Dibbling should get okay minutes. He might get the odd return. And hopefully, you're not relying on these assets on a consistent basis, such as Carvalho and Dibbling. Mavididi and Rodgers, I would be more happy relying on a consistent basis. So that's how I feel about the cheaper assets. When we then move up probably a price category, let's say from 5.6 to 6.5, I do think it's the Spurs mids that stand out for me. And Johnson and Kulusevski are both really nice options. I would actually say eye test-wise, I prefer Kulusevski, but the data definitely points to Johnson. Kulusevski's playing as the number 10. He's been very creative. Johnson is playing on the right-hand side, basically like a right forward at points, and he's getting a lot more goal threat. In terms of who is more nailed, I think they're both as likely as each other to start. Maybe Kulusevski slightly more likely to not miss out. But in terms of who gets 90 minutes, Kulusevski has now played 4 90-minute games in a row in the Premier League. Johnson does come off early, sometimes as early as sort of 65, 70 minutes. That hasn't seemed to matter recently. I think Johnson scored 5 goals in a row now in 5 games. So the man is on fire. So just as a result, more goal threat, better data. I think I am leaning Brennan Johnson just. But if you don't have the funds for him or you just want a slightly different pick, I really do like Kulusevski. And then obviously there has to be a shout out to Dwight McNeil, who has been really good in recent weeks. And the fixture run that they have coming up is exceptionally good now for Everton. So I certainly don't mind a punt on Dwight McNeil. So those would be my 3 favourite at that price. I still like Smith Rowe, by the way. And the fixtures are starting to ease up a little bit after the Man City game. They're actually not terrible. So if you've got Smith Rowe in your team, I'd definitely keep him. And I wouldn't mind bringing him in, assuming that you can bench him this week. For that price between 6.6 and 8, I've selected 3, but there are a couple of other options that aren't on here. Trossard isn't on here, but I really like as an option. I just think the man in third place, Martinelli, is maybe a slightly safer option for minutes because, yes, Trossard could play out on the left, but he tends to be preferred through the middle. And I just do think in the odd game, Jesus could start ahead of Trossard. So as a result, I think Martinelli's minutes are slightly safer than Trossard's, but both of them could be good options. Also, the man that I mentioned earlier, Anthony Gordon. on penalties, playing as the 9, even once he's not playing as the 9 and on penalties, we know how consistent he can be, and Isak being back will probably help his overall output. And the fixtures aren't terrible now. After that City game's out the way, for Newcastle, the fixtures they're sort of middling. They're not bad. So I don't mind a cheeky punt on Anthony Gordon. And then the other player that's not on here, Jared Bowen, plays Ipswich this week. You could take a punt on him. I've just not really seen enough from West Ham recently. So for me then, the best option at that price is Bryan Mbeumo. It's one of those where I know if you don't own Bryan Mbeumo right now, you probably feel like, I don't want to bring him in. Everyone and their mum has got Bryan Mbeumo in their team. It just feels obvious. And maybe I could go against him. And to be honest, you absolutely could, by the way. But I also feel like it's almost overthinking it. When I look at the fixtures, they're brilliant. He's got the minutes, he's got the penalties, he's got the data. Even without Wissa in the team, he's still got 2 goals in 2. And I do think Wissa being out does weaken that attack for Brentford. He probably won't have quite as many returns. But again, I also do feel like it's overthinking it slightly not going for Bryan Mbeumo. So he would be first for me. And then if you don't want to go for Bryan Mbeumo, or you've already got him, James Maddison, despite being significantly more expensive than Johnson and Kulusevski, or at least a fair bit, he's still a good option in his own right. But when I do compare him to those cheaper assets, Maddison is playing quite a deep role. His underlying data is very good, but he's playing almost like a hybrid between a 6 and an 8, whereas Kulusevski's playing as a 10, and Johnson, like I said, is playing as almost like a right forward. So for me, I don't know fully if the money justifies going for Maddison over Kulusevski or Johnson, but he's still a really good shout. And then Martinelli, like I said, along with Trossard, for this week in particular, they look like fantastic assets. Assuming that they both start, which I think they will, I really like a punt on either of those, and I'd probably lean Martinelli for the slightly better long-term minutes. Obviously, if you have more money than that, I do really like Palmer, Saka, and Foden. Now, I would, if possible, let's say that Luis Diaz is ruled out, I would try your best, even potentially if it's 4 or -4, to get to Palmer, Saka, or Foden. The reason for that is not only that I think Palmer, Saka, and Foden are obviously better than the other options on this list, but I think what you need to do in FPL is try and get to the optimal structure and try and get to a point where your team is set up in a way that benefits you moving forward. And as I've said on my wildcard all week, I think the structure that most people are trying to probably move towards now is a 3 premium team with 2 premium midfielders at least. I think Haaland plus Saka and Palmer, or if you can squeeze a Salah in there, great. 4 now is probably the best structure from game week 7 to about game week 11 or 12. And then I think around game week maybe 10 to 12, people will start transitioning out of Haaland and into Salah, in which case we'll get to probably a team where the optimal structure is probably a 3 premium midfield structure. Now, if you've already used your wildcard, it's not going to be easy to get to that. So when you've got an opportunity here to do so, even if it is for a -4, I do wonder if just getting another premium midfielder in, regardless of who it is out of the 3, might just start to move you towards a structure that you want to stay in. So whilst I don't normally advise -4s, and it probably involves you taking out someone like a Trent, which isn't great this week because it's a nice fixture for him, I do wonder if starting to move towards that 2 premium midfield structure might be the best strategy. And believe it or not, and this will be against what most people would suggest and what I normally would, I've got Palmer in first. That's because I actually don't mind the fixture this week. And whilst I know the fixtures aren't great over the next few, they're not great for Saka over the next 5, if you look at them in its entirety. And for Foden, they are, but Foden is, of course, not on penalties, not on a lot of set pieces, and is also more of a minutes risk. So I think when you put it together, especially considering that Palmer's price is just going to keep going up and up and up, I would probably target Palmer this week, despite the fixture being obviously better for Saka. I just think you're going to want to have Palmer eventually. Why not try and move for him now? I had to cut there due to the loudest siren you've ever heard, but to put all of that together, I would, if possible, try and move towards a premium asset, but don't completely break your team. If it's requiring like a -8, don't do that. But if you can, without harming your team too much, move to a premium, that would be first choice. After that, is Bryan Mbeumo, and after that, it's probably a Spurs midfielder, and I think Johnson and Kulusevski are favoured for me ahead of Maddison right now, especially when you take into account pricing. So, premium, Mbeumo, Spurs mid, and if you're really new to, Rodgers and Mavididi aren't too bad. Let me know who you are potentially looking at selling Diaz for, and I want to reiterate, I wouldn't do it unless we get confirmation that he doesn't start, because I still think there is a reasonable chance that Diaz starts in Game Week 7. So guys, another discussion that you wanted me to have was around captaincy in Game Week 7, and it's definitely a conversation to be had around it, because as much as we love captaining Haaland at home at the Etihad, and we know how brilliant he has been and can continue to be, There are other premiums that are performing incredibly well, and Fulham haven't been terrible defensively, as we'll discuss in a second. So, yeah, there is a conversation to be had. So, on this list, I've got Haaland, Watkins, Havertz, Salah, Palmer, Saka. You might want to go a bit more differential. Solanke and Burmo spring to mind as two other players that could do fairly well. But for me, these would be the 6 that I'm choosing from. They are all relatively expensive assets, but they're expensive normally for a reason. And what I've got for each player is non-penalty expected goals per 90, expected assists per 90, shots in the box per 90, opponent XGC rank. So first would mean they are the best defence in the league this season. 20th would mean they are the worst defence in the league this season. And then I've looked at if it is a good positional matchup for the player. And what I mean by that is I've looked at the defences that they're playing against and looked at where they concede most of their chances from. If it is a tick, it means it is a good positional matchup. If it's a cross, it means it's not. So for example, Man United concede most of their chances through the centre of the pitch. Therefore, it is a good positional matchup for Watkins. Fulham do not concede most of their chances through the centre of the pitch. They concede it from, I can't remember which flank it is. I think it's the right side for City. So wherever Savio or Foden could play, I suppose. So that is not a particularly good matchup for Erling Haaland. Obviously, that is only one very small thing to look at. I wouldn't rely on that, but it's just another thing that we can add in these videos to look at to hopefully help us with these key decisions. So let's put all of it together and let's discuss who I think is the best captaincy option for Game Week 7. The first thing to note is around penalties. I always prefer to captain a penalty taker. And therefore, for me, always, I feel slightly more uncomfortable captaining someone like Watkins or Havertz. In every video I've released this week, people are like, how do you know Watkins not on penalties? In all honesty, I don't. I don't know that because they've not had a penalty this season without Douglas Luiz in the team. But Watkins' penalty record is not very good. He was on a penalties either last season, maybe the season before for a short spell, but he missed a few of them. And as a result, he was taken off them and he was never put back on. And also, Tielemans has a great penalty record and he's been playing very good minutes. So yeah, absolutely, Watkins might have been practicing them in the summer. He might step up and take one. But I think as of right now, it'll be Tielemans. I wouldn't be surprised if John Duran's on the pitch, if he steps up and takes one. And also, Morgan Rogers took a penalty for the under-21s for England and absolutely dispatched it top bins. So no, I don't know that Watkins not on penalties. But I also wouldn't be surprised if he's not because of his poor record and the fact that he's not really taken them much in the past. And obviously, we know that Havertz isn't going to be unless Saka decides to give him one. So as of right now, that is obviously a slight weakness of captaining someone like a Watkins or Havertz, that they don't have that additional routes to points. I also look at set pieces, and Palmer and Saka are on set pieces. Salah takes very, very, very few, if any, maybe a direct free kick. And again, Havertz, Watkins, and Haaland aren't on set pieces. So the only two players here that are on pretty much everything are Palmer and Saka, which is a massive advantage for them. But then when we look at non-penalty expected goals per 90, they are the two lowest on the list. We have Haaland at the top with 0.85, then Watkins, then Havertz, then Salah, then Palmer, then Saka. So in terms of goal threat, Palmer and Saka have the lowest on this list. In terms of expected assists, well, actually, Saka and Palmer have the highest. It's basically those with the highest goal threat have the lowest expected assist, and those with the highest creativity have the lowest goal threat. And it means overall, the numbers are relatively similar for a lot of these players. Obviously, Haaland stands out just due to his insane goal threat. But when you put all of the data together, there's not a lot to separate these players. So for me, underlying data is useful. It always is. But in these cases, I wonder if it's less so. Like, they've all got incredibly high chance of returning in any given game. They've showed that so far this season. So what maybe it comes down to more is maybe the matchup and just your general gut feeling about what they can do. And also maybe like finishing ability as well. It's something that I probably don't give enough credit to. Haaland is a ridiculous finisher. So his data is slightly better than the others on this list, but his finishing is probably comfortably better than anyone else on this list just because of how good he is. Maybe someone like a Cole Palmer as well, who's shown us across the last maybe 14 months that he will outperform his data because he's a very, very clinical finisher when he gets his chances. So maybe these are other things we need to start thinking about. The other thing, of course, like I said, is the fixture and the matchup. So players that I would rule out, I don't know if I would rule... Palmer, I still think this is a good fixture because it's at home, and Palmer has shown that he can return against anybody. But Forest, over such a long sample size now, have just shown that they are a very decent defence. They beat Liverpool 1-0 at Anfield. Last season, they were 4th for expected goals conceded. This season, they are 3rd for expected goals conceded. Now, I don't think Sells is a very good goalkeeper, which has to be taken into account because it's not just defensive ability, it's also the goalkeeper. But I don't look at this as a particularly good fixture for Palmer. Then when you also look at the positional matchup, they do not concede most of their chances down the centre or down their left, Chelsea's right. In fact, where they concede most of their chances from is down their right side, which would be Chelsea's left. So that's the only position that Palmer doesn't really pick up on the pitch. He's either central or out wide right. And so data-wise, it's not a great matchup. Positional-wise, where they can see their chances from, it's not a great matchup. Of course, it could just be that Palmer picks up the ball and scores an absolute world. He gets a penalty as well, and he comes away with a brace. We've seen that it doesn't necessarily matter about things like underlying data, but when we're trying to make these decisions, that's all I can really go off. So for me, when I put that together, Palmer doesn't look like as great of a captaincy option this week. I could have got that massively wrong, but as a result, I'm not looking at Palmer captain. Another player that doesn't have a great matchup and also is playing against a defence that has been quite good is actually Erling Haaland. Now, this is very different because Haaland is Haaland and City is City, especially at the Etihad. But Fulham are 7th for expected goals conceded this season. They have had pretty good opening fixtures, by the way, and that is something to take into account, that their data might be slightly inflated by the fact they've played some pretty rubbish attacks in general. But also, Fulham do not, again, concede most of their chances down the centre. So this is a week for me that you could look to go against Haaland. I would just never feel comfortable going against Haaland if I owned him in a week that he's got a home fixture against a defence that aren't traditionally that strong. And Fulham aren't really a defence you'd say, oh, I don't really want to target them. So it doesn't feel great me saying that I wouldn't go out there and captain Haaland, but it's definitely a week that you could look to go against him if you wanted to, which leaves us obviously with Watkins, Havertz, Salah and Saka. On Ollie Watkins, I never feel comfortable captaining him because of the penalties and because of the lack of set pieces. And also, forwards in general don't seem to score as many points as midfielders unless you're looking at Erling Haaland. We've seen that over a consistent basis now. The extra point for the clean sheet, the extra point for the goal, midfielders just tend to do slightly better. So I never feel comfortable captaining Watkins. And especially with Man United, they're so unpredictable. I'm a Man United fan. I know how bad we are, by the way. And I expect Aston Villa to comfortably score a couple of goals here, if not 3-4 goals. But I also wouldn't be surprised if Ten Hag just puts in a performance that just about saves him his job. And that's not delusion. It's just Man United managers seem to do this, where they're almost getting sacked and then they pull a performance out of nowhere. And also, Man United, I think, beat Villa twice last season, at least once. It's a bit of a bogey team for them. In these kind of games, I'm never sure exactly how they're going to go. It's not biased. In fact, I'm probably the opposite as a Man United fan. I'm more pessimistic than I'm optimistic. But something doesn't feel quite right for me about captaining Watkins. That being said, United have been really poor defensively this season. They are 15th for expected goals conceded, and it is a good matchup for Watkins, and his underlying data is very strong. So I'm definitely not going to talk anyone out of Watkins captain. He's definitely in my top few options this week. With Mohamed Salah, yeah, he's a great captaincy option. Lots of shots in the box, really good data. It's a good matchup for him. Crystal Palace concede most of their chances exactly where Salah operates. And also, they've not been particularly good this season. They're a middling defence at best, and they've not had particularly terrible opening fixtures. So I look at this and say, yeah, it's not a particularly perfect fixture and matchup for Salah, but at the same time, it's not a bad one. Salah this week feels like a very decent, safe captaincy option, and you'd probably expect him to return, as he tends to do pretty much every week. So yeah, I actually quite like a Salah captaincy shout. But if I'm putting together everything for me points towards it being a Havertz or Saka captaincy. And I say this as someone that at the moment, by the way, my armband is on Haaland, mainly just because of how much I've been punished this season. I almost feel like I can't go against Haaland, especially now I finally own him. I almost just want a stress-free weekend where I can just put the armband on Erling Haaland. But like I said, when I look at everything put together, it is pointing towards an Arsenal captaincy, because Southampton have been woeful this season. They're 17th for expected goals conceded per 90. I don't even think they've necessarily had the worst set of opening fixtures either. There are definitely teams that have had worse fixtures. And they just look, especially in the last 2 or 3 weeks, really, really bad. Russell Martin is struggling to get the best out of them. They're still trying to play out the back. And whilst I think there are teams that press maybe slightly higher and slightly more aggressively than Arsenal, Arsenal won't just let them play out the back however they want. This has like a 4-0 written all over it for me for Arsenal. And if you're expecting Arsenal to score 3 or 4 goals, then you have to consider captaining Havertz or Saka. If you look at the bookies' odds, Arsenal are expected to score more goals this week than someone like a Man City. Then, when you also take into account where Southampton concede most of their chances from is through the centre of the pitch and on Saka's flank, not on Martinelli's side, it's again pointing towards Havertz and Saka as being the best options because they operate on that right-hand side. Even Havertz at the moment in this 4-4-2 formation is operating more so on Saka's side. So everything is pointing towards right now lots of opportunities to score goals and get returns for Havertz and Saka. The only thing that points you back to someone like an Erling Haaland for me is that it's Haaland. City are so good at the Etihad, and Haaland, especially at home, is just so clinical. He often gets multiple attacking returns. So there we go. I don't know that I've probably helped you at all there, but I don't like just saying this is the player to captain them, because I can't predict the future and I'd rather you make your own decisions. But to recap that, for me, Palmer and Watkins wouldn't be an option, because Palmer, I don't think the fixture is there as much, and I don't quite like the matchup as much, especially with the way that Forest defend. Watkins, I just think this is a very difficult to predict game. I know on paper United have been awful. They've just beat Bayern Munich. United have just had a terrible performance against Porto. Everything is pointing towards an absolute battering, and it could go that way, but it often doesn't. And because of the lack of penalties, we think, and the lack of set pieces, for me, Watkins just isn't quite as good of an option as some of these other players. And also, Duran, if he doesn't start, probably could take minutes off of Watkins. So Palmer and Watkins, I'm not as interested in. I think Salah is fine, by the way. I really do. And if you're not sure, defaulting back to Salah is not an issue. And we've seen against Palace in the past, he's often a haul. There was that one time when he came off the bench and scored like 16 points off the bench. I remember that very vividly. It's not a bad fixture for him, and he has been very, very consistent. He's on pens. I don't mind Salah, but for me, it is coming back every time to an Arsenal attacker or Haaland. I don't have Havertz, so for me, it's between Saka and Haaland. If I had Havertz, I almost believe that Havertz might be a better captaincy option than Saka this week. His goal threat is just much higher. It's double that of Saka this season. So even though he doesn't have the pens and he doesn't have the set pieces, which would usually make me just much prefer Saka, I do wonder if Havertz might be a slightly better captaincy option this week. So yeah, there would be some slight temptation if I had him to give him the armband, but because I don't, it's between Saka and Haaland for me. I am leaning Haaland at the moment just due to Haaland's ridiculous consistency and ability to score goals, but everything matchup-wise and fixture-wise is pointing me back towards Saka. If Ødegaard was fit, it might push me towards Saka slightly more, because I think with Ødegaard being out, Saka's just taken on slightly more of the creativity and getting slightly fewer opportunities to score goals. So as of right now, where I stand with captaincy, Haaland, Havertz, Saka, Salah, Palmer, Watkins. In that order. That is just my order based on my own gut feeling and how I'm analysing the data. I often get captaincy wrong, so take it with a pinch of salt. But yeah, on the deadline stream tomorrow, I'll be going back and forth between Haaland and Saka. I'd love to know down below in the comments, is anyone interested in captaining someone other than Erling Haaland? So I think because a lot of people wildcarded into very similar teams last week, lots of people have the decision around starting Rodgers versus starting someone like a Calvert-Lewin or a Wood instead, or maybe even a Semenyo. So who would I start? And again, this is just down to my own sort of intuition, gut feeling, and how I would approach it. I'll answer that final question first. Is benching Semenyo rather than Rodgers a bad choice? Yes, I think personally myself, I would rather start Semenyo than Calvert-Lewin, Rodgers, and Wood. That is because I think it's a good fixture firstly, but Semenyo has just been highly impressive this season. He's got better data than anyone on this list. And whilst he doesn't have penalties, we don't think anyway, it's probably Cliver or even Ilson, and Calvert-Lewin and Wood will have penalties, I still think it's worth probably starting Semenyo. So Semenyo would be top of the list for me. I think Calvert-Lewin, Rodgers and Wood, it's a lot more difficult. The first thing you need to think about is like, how do you approach the game? What is important to you as an FPL manager? Because I value penalties quite highly and I value minutes quite highly. So the first thing I need to think about is a player on pens and does a player have good minutes? And also additional routes to points like set pieces. Now, as far as I'm aware, none of these players are taking regular set pieces. Rodgers might take the odd one, but none of these are taking regular set pieces out of Wood, Rodgers and Calvert-Lewin. So that's not a particular discussion. For penalties, we don't think Rodgers will be on penalties, although we still don't know, like I said. And Calvert-Lewin and Wood probably are on penalties, / Calvert-Lewin definitely is on penalties. So far, in terms of set pieces and penalties, is all leading us back towards saying probably bench Rodgers. If we're looking at minutes, I would say it suggests probably benching Chris Wood. He's had very good minutes, by the way, but Rodgers and Calvert-Lewin each week feel more likely to go and get you 90 minutes. So that doesn't really help us that much there because it goes back and forth on each player. I guess Calvert-Lewin stands out there as being a good player to have and to start because he has 90 minutes and he has pens. The next thing you need to look at is, of course, the matchup. And I think with the fact that Manchester United have been all over the place recently, it looks very good for Rodgers. And Newcastle are starting to turn the form around a little bit. It was a very good performance against Man City. Assuming that Fabian Schär and Pope are available, the defence isn't as weak. If either of those miss out, then of course it might point back towards Calvert-Lewin. So matchup-wise, we are probably pointing back towards Rodgers being the one that you'd like to start. Chelsea have actually been very good defensively this season. They've gone under the radar slightly how good their defence has been. So I don't really love the fixture as much for Chris Wood, especially given that it's away. So putting that together, Chris Wood for me probably stands out as the one that I would be happiest benching out of the three. And I think Rodgers versus Calvert-Lewin is genuinely a 50-50 coin flip. I right now would ever so slightly lean towards starting Calvert-Lewin just for the penalties. That is literally it. And I know Everton don't get many penalties, and there's no confirmation that Calvert-Lewin would even score the pen. But I think when it is such a close call, I always lean towards the penalty taker, because if he does get a penalty, because he's very good for bonus, that's a 9-pointer probably, then possibly anything else from open play, I just have to lean towards the penalty taker when I think it's close. But for you, if you're thinking Everton probably won't get a pen, I think the fixture's better for Rodgers. He's in a nice run of form. He's a midfielder, so he gets an extra point for a goal, extra point for a clean sheet. All of these things ring true. Maybe you go for Morgan Rodgers. So for me, Semenyo definitely above all of them. Then it's a 50-50 between Calvert-Lewin and Rodgers. I would just lean Calvert-Lewin, and then it's Chris Wood. Hopefully that helps you, and let me know down below in the comments if you're making the decision between the two, who you're currently leaning toward. So I thought I would just end the video by briefly going over my updated wildcard draft and discussing what might possibly change between now and the deadline. So in terms of how much has changed since my previous team selection that I did yesterday, it's literally only one position, which is Mykolenko has come out and Ait-Nouri has come in. The reason for that is obviously Mykolenko is rumoured to potentially have a very small minor injury, which might see him back as early as game week 8, if it's even true, by the way. And Branthwaite is rumoured to have, again, a minor injury, which might not be true, and it might only be for a short period of time. So I might regret making the change, but I wasn't that enamoured by Mykolenko anyway, and I think Ait-Nouri is a really nice alternative. This week, if I need to call upon him, if Rico Lewis is rumoured to not be starting, I can. Next week, I don't need to start him, because next week I would hopefully start Lewis and Gabriel, and then I would have Leif Davis, who has Everton at home. So in game week 8, I don't need Ait-Nouri. And then from game week 9, in all honesty, I probably wouldn't play him every week, but I can rotate him and Leif Davis again, dependent upon who has the better fixture and which team is playing better. Because Leif Davis himself has a really nice run of fixtures up until about game week 17, game week 18. It's game week 16, 17. So I really like them too. People will say, how on earth have you got an Ipswich and a Wolves defender in your team and you have to start one of them each week? In all honesty, like, unless you're paying super premium for defenders, I don't think any of them are that great. I know Cole, by the way, I could afford Colwill instead of Ait-Nouri. And in terms of defensive data, Cole's a much better option than Ait-Nouri and Leif Davis. But he's also got no real attacking threat. And I still think Chelsea concede in a lot of their upcoming games. So it's just a bit of a fun punt on two players that are very attacking. Both Davis and Ait-Nouri basically play like attackers a lot of the time. Leif Davis is on every set piece, basically, for Ipswich. He takes in-swing and out-swing in corners, free kicks. He's exceptionally good from open play. We see the data already this season, 0.22 XGI. He's worth going for. And the same with Ait-Nouri, to be honest, 0.23 XGI. So I'm basically picking them as two very cheap attackers, is what I'm doing in my mind. So I like those two. I know that the bench is very weak. People point to the fact I've got Ait-Nouri, Vandenberg, Diblin. I'm slightly concerned about Vandenberg now because Rico Henry's back in training, and I do think that that will cause some rotation for Vandenberg. But at the same time, I don't think I want to go for Greaves because I've got Davis, and I think having two Ipswich defenders is bonkers, even if one of them will very rarely play. I could go for a Leicester 4.0 defender. That's slightly more tempting, but at the same time, I think it might be worth the risk going for Vandenberg and hoping he can stay in the starting 11, because I don't ever really want to play a Leicester defender, considering that they wouldn't have much attacking threat. I know I'm starting an Ipswich defender here, but he's got the attacking threat to go with it. So that's sort of the discussion around those cheap mids. Around Dibbling and Cunha, they will be the other two picks that stand out here. Cunha, for the same reasons, has got really nice fixtures. And he's on penalties, we think. And he's a 90-minute man, right? He's a player that's going to play 90 minutes in pretty much every game. So I like the punt on Cunha when not many others are looking at him. And the reason for Dibbling is, firstly, my team value is pretty terrible. But secondly, when Cunha plays against Man City in game week 8, Tyler Dibbling's got Leicester at home. So he can cover me next week if I decide not to play Cunha. And by the way, I might play Cunha, right? I've not fully ruled out the idea of playing Cunha. But if I don't want to, Dibbling's got a really nice fixture. So I might play a 3-5-2 next week. So that's kind of the justification for the team. And obviously I've got Palmer and Saka in there, which I don't think many people would really complain with overall. Apologies for how loud it is outside. I've had to cut this video like 20 times because of that. But ignore that. The background noise can stay for this section. So I think the only thing remaining for me to decide is if we get a rumour tomorrow, let's say we get a double whammy rumour that Lewis, or a leak, that Lewis doesn't start and Foden does start. I've thought about this in my mind because obviously if Lewis doesn't start, I could just start 8 Nuri. There's a bit of a clash with Brian and Burmo, but I don't mind it. I could just start a back 3 of Gabriel Davis, 8 Nuri, and just leave it like that. Or I could look to sell Lewis because I just think, do you know what? This is the first week on a wildcard. He doesn't start. Maybe I don't want the headache. Maybe move to his teammate Gvardiol. But in order to do that, I'd have to make a downgrade. Now, this is where if we get news that Foden starts comes in, that's an option. So something I've toyed with, I don't love this because I do really want Palmer. So I doubt I'm going to do this, but I just want to discuss the possibility, is Palmer to Foden and Rico Lewis to Gvardiol. That's assuming that we get the news that Gvardiol starts, Lewis is benched, and Foden starts, which is a lot of information to get. But we do sometimes get early City team news, despite them playing at 3 p.m. I don't think this team's that much weaker, but I, of course, then don't have Cole Palmer. The idea would be then, around game week 12, and I would probably have to go without until then, I might move Saka to Palmer then. Or if Foden ends up not starting the week after, I might have to use 2 transfers to potentially shift from Foden back to Palmer again. It feels like something that could work very well this week if we get a leak that Foden starts. But at the same time, I think I want Palmer in the team. So I think if we get a leak tomorrow, which I do think is a possibility, by the way, that Lewis doesn't start, I'd probably keep him and bench him. The other final possibility, and I don't want to talk about too many options, is I go for Colwell instead of Lewis, and I upgrade Vandenberg to Mikalenko, who I know is not available at the moment, we think anyway, based on the rumour. But I just tuck him third sub until he is, and then it's a much stronger backline in terms of squad depth. It's not a particularly strong backline in terms of 4 of my defenders are Davis, Mikalenko, Colwell, 8 Nuri, but it just gives me a little bit more option, and it means I don't have to have a 4.0 defender. I'm going to leave it there. That's the current plan right now. I think it would be 8 Nuri that I'd start instead of Lewis if we get a leak that Lewis doesn't start. But if you look at kind of bookies odds, projected points, stuff like that, chance of a clean sheet, Vandenberg instead of 8 Nuri probably makes a bit more sense. But I just think I'd probably go for the upside of 8 Nuri. So with that very loud siren in the background, that is it. Let me know what you think of my team selection. So guys, there we have it. That is my Game Week 7 deadline decisions video and also an update on my wildcard draft. If you did enjoy that video, please do smash that like button. And if you are new around here and you've watched to this point, please do consider subscribing. Until next time, which will be the deadline stream tomorrow. Thank you very much for watching. Bye-bye.